Greetings everyone. Today we are on day 17 of PMP6 exam prep step by step. Today we'll take up project risk management. In our last class, if you look at the project process table, what we did in our last session was project communication management. We saw 3 processes. And the next knowledge area is project risk management. This is what we're taking up now. And if you look at it closely, we will see that there are 7 processes in this particular knowledge area, out of which 5 of them are in the planning process group, and 1 of them in executing process group, 1 in the monitoring process group. Now, this is quite an important knowledge area, and of course, its application varies from project to project in the sense that complex projects request more attention to risk management than simpler projects. And we'll cover this in 2 sessions. Today we'll do 3 processes, and the rest of them we'll take up in our next session on Monday. Now, if we take a look at an overview, risk management. Now, risk management, before talking about what we are doing and what is the risk management referring to here, we may recall some discussion about risk. And basically, risk is what is the uncertainty. The uncertainty in the project gives rise to risk. And this uncertainty can be positive uncertainty or negative uncertainty. In other words, if it is a positive uncertainty, then there is some kind of opportunities that might be available to us. And if it is a negative uncertainty, there is probably a threat on the horizon, and which will have negative impact on our project. So risk management is about trying to increase the likelihood and impact of positive risk when there is something that we see there can be some opportunity. And we want to increase the likelihood and impact of that. This is our objective in the risk management. Another objective is, if we see there is a negative risk on the horizon, then our approach should be, or our effort would be here through the risk management process, is to decrease the likelihood of it happening and decrease the impact of that particular negative risk. So this is what we'll be dealing with risk management. Now, if we look at different processes, the first process that we look at is the planned risk management. Now, the planned risk management is, again, like other plans, it is a subsidiary of the project plan, and we'll see how to conduct these risk management activities. We'll put together a roadmap how to go about all the risk management processes. Then we'll take up identify risk. This is where we'll do different things, use different tools to actually determine or identify what are the risks that are there in the project. Then, once we've identified, we move to the perform qualitative and risk analysis. Now here, what we do is we look at all the risks that we have identified, and we will try to prioritize it. We look at the probability, impact, and some other factors, and we will prioritize it in the senses which are the risks that we should give more priority and which one not so. So this is what we'll be going through in this particular qualitative risk analysis. Then we'll move to the quantitative risk analysis. And quantitative risk analysis will apply numerical methods, numerical analysis to look at more on the risks that we have prioritized. And we will not only look at the individual project risk, but also the overall project risk. We'll talk about what is the difference between them. Then once we have done this analysis, qualitative risk analysis and quantitative risk analysis, we will move into the process which is the planned risk response. Basically, we will put together an action plan. We'll strategize and we'll put together an action of all these risks that we have identified and analyzed. If this risk comes in, what kind of steps we will take? If that risk comes in, what are the steps that we will take? So we'll look at how to strategize those different risks that we have identified. Then we'll move to the process which is implement agreed upon risk plans. Basically, we have made a plan, identify the risk, made a plan for each of these, and then when we're executing, we'll implement whatever the risk responses we have thought of whenever any of the risk that is triggered. And then finally, we'll look at the monitor risk, which is to really track if we are doing or how are we doing against the plan in managing the risk. And if some changes needs to come into the risk management process and so on. So this is a very brief overview of different risk processes, risk management processes that we'll be handling in our project management. Now the question is, why take risk? Now, if you look at a project, or any project, projects are inherently risky. Many things can go wrong. There is a lot of uncertainty, and that uncertainty or how risk there depends on the variability, depends on the complexity, and so on. Having said that, we still go about projects because we foresee or we are going to get some benefit out of that risk. And so there is a risk and reward balancing, if you may. We have risk in the project, but we are willing to take that risk. We are willing to go with that project, though there are risks, because we see benefit and reward coming out of the project. Having said that, the risk that will be there should be a conscious choice at all levels of the organization. Everyone should be together in understanding what are the risks involved in the project and what we are doing about it. And any successful organization actually proactively manage risks. They don't just hope for the best. That is not an approach that we should think of. Just hope nothing is going to happen, because when a risk gets triggered, and depending on the impact it might have, it can be really fatal in the sense that it can bring down the project, it can bring down the organization. So we have to very carefully, we take a measured approach when we take a risk and deliberate upon what actions we'll take if that happens to get triggered. Now, there are different types of risk. So it's good to understand what are the different types of risk. It'll give us a very well-rounded picture about what risks are. The first and foremost, let's discuss about the business risk and pure risk. Now, business risks are risks that we consciously take up in the course of the business because we see there is a benefit that is going to come out from that particular project for that particular effort or initiative. And though there are risks, we consciously take because there is some business benefit. As opposed to business risks, there are pure risks. Pure risk is there is no benefit. It's like, the natural causes that happens. They are pure risk. If there is a hurricane, there is an earthquake. These are pure risk, and it can happen, it happens. So pure risks have no, there is nothing, no benefit that we can think of. Then there is a positive risk and negative risks. We talked about that. Now, positive risks are those risks that can give us a positive outcome, or you might call it opportunities. Negative risks are those risks that will have a negative impact on our projects, or they are threats. We can call them threats. Then there are known risk and unknown risk. We talked about known risk and unknown risk. Now, known risks, again, to refresh our memory, known risks are those risks that we can plan for, that we can visualize, we can think about that might happen, because we know these are situations that can come about. And those risks, what we do is we have a contingency reserve for those non-known risks, and we even include it in the schedule and cost baseline. As opposed to known risks, there are unknown risks that we have no way to know, we cannot even think, and it is going to come as a surprise, and that happens. And this unknown risk, the way we handle is by keeping a management reserve, and which is not within the baseline, if you remember, it is outside the baseline, in addition to the baseline, and which is held within the management control. So known risk and unknown risk. Known risk is for contingency reserve, unknown risk for management reserve. Then there are individual project risks and overall risks, or overall project risk. Now, individual project risks are those risks that will impact one or more objectives in the project. So maybe it will something that will impact your schedule. So, and that is what you identify, and that is an individual project risk. Whereas overall project risk, maybe because of different project risks and some other external sources and other sources, it will impact the project as a whole. So there are two categories of risk. Individual project risk really is about that will affect the project objectives, and overall project risk will impact the project as a whole. Then there is another category, which is we call event and non-event risk. In fact, most of this risk that we talked about, or we talk about most of the time, are what is event risk, because we foresee an event taking place and that will impact our project. So they are generally event risk. Now, there has been a recent trend that we need to consider even the non-event risk. Now, what is non-event risk? There are two types we can think of. One is, which is called variability risk. Now, when we are executing a project, there can be different variability. For example, the productivity. The productivity can be variable in the project, as a result of which there is a risk to the outcome of the project. And now there is no event here, but it is coming out of the variability. And so this is called variability risk. It's a non-event risk. Another type of non-event risk is what is called ambiguity risk. For example, you are drawing requirement documents, and there is a ambiguity in terms of what the user have told us and what we have understood, and that may result into some risk. So this is called ambiguity risk because there is some ambiguity, there is a gap in what was told to us, what we have understood, what we might go and implement. And for the variability risk, the way we handle and address that is by things like Monte Carlo simulation, where we look at all the different kinds of variability and then measure what is the probability of it happening and so on. Whereas ambiguity, we can again address that through some other means, like for example, we might put a prototype and so that ambiguity gets mitigated or get reduced. So these are the different types of risk. We have business risk and pure risk. We have positive risk and negative risk. We have known risk and unknown risk. We have individual project risk and overall project risk, and we have event risk and non-event risk. Now, there are some factors that influence risk perception. In a sense, a lot of it is about the perception and what is perceived by the organization in terms of the risk by the stakeholder is important for us in the project in understanding or how we would handle the risk, or how much risk we should take, or how much we should spend or in actually mitigating the risk. So there are three different terms that is often used, and they might be confusing, but it's useful to understand the difference. One is called risk appetite, we come across often, risk tolerance, and risk threshold. Now, risk appetite is really the degree of uncertainty in anticipation of reward. Basically, it is a statement about degree of uncertainty. And this risk tolerance is the degree, amount, or volume of risk it will withstand. So you are being a little more specific in risk tolerance. And when you come to risk threshold, it is much more specific. It's saying that level of impact at which there is a specific interest. Okay, if it is at that level, I'm fine. But beyond that, no, I'm not with you. So that is the kind of statement that will come out of risk threshold. So let's look at some examples. For risk appetite, someone say, hey, I'm a high risk guy. I can take a lot of risk. Or no, sorry, I am very conservative when it comes to risk. I would like to play safe. That is the kind of statement you see when someone is expressing their risk appetite. Whereas in terms of risk tolerance, they'll be more specific. They'll say, well, I can take risk up to 5% of the project cost. So it's like how much I can withstand, and so on. Whereas when you come to risk threshold, it is a level, it is a threshold, a line, saying that I cannot take risk more than $50,000. Okay, with a confidence of level of 66% or whatever. So basically, as you move from risk appetite to threshold, there is an increase of measurability. So we should be conscious about the measurability when we talk about risk perception of stakeholders, when they express their risk perception, because that is how we'll be able to incorporate their view or risk threshold, risk perception into our project. Now, typically, the more complex, the more variable an environment is, there will be more risk. And so, if you remember, when we are talking about the agile environment, the adaptive environment, these are the environment, and we adopt that approach, agile approach, because there is a lot of variability, a lot of things can change. And so the way the risk is handled by this kind of environment is every iteration. When we move to iteration, risk is analyzed, identified, and managed for every iteration. And so what happens is, as you are going through the iteration, you are ensuring that you have the control on the risk. And because we are, even the risk document is a live document, it is changing as we move along with iteration, the risk gets mitigated much better with that approach. Now, with this as our background, let's move on to our first process, which is plan risk management. The plan risk management as a process, the inputs that we get are project to the plan risk management process are project charter, some of the documents, project management plan, and we'll have different tools that we'll talk about. And the main output that will come out is the risk management plan. Now, risk management plan, like we said before, it is how we are going to do. It's our roadmap. So it really defines how risk management activities will be conducted. What is the approach we're going to take? And when we do that, we also need to be aware that the risk in a project should be aligned to how important or the type of the project is. Because if for example, there is a project and it is not giving us a whole lot of benefit, it's a small project, but the risk is so high, then we have to really think, do we need to go with this project? So they need to commensurate with that of the importance of the project. And risk management process, again, we should take into consideration what is the stakeholder expectation, what is the stakeholder perception, and we should take that into consideration when we are planning the risk management for the project. Now, this risk management plan, we will go through this process at predefined stages in the project, depending on how large the project is. Yes, sometimes maybe it's one if it is small, but if it's a larger project at predefined points, we'll look through the risk management, review it, and update it, and so on. Now, when we go through that risk management, and when we do this, we go through different kinds of data analysis, interviews, and actually produce this plan, risk management plan. So what will this risk management plan have? It will consist of some or all of these points that we are going to talk about. One is the risk strategy, which is really what will be the approach, risk approach. For example, some projects, we might say we'll just have qualitative risk. We'll not do any kind of quantitative risk. So what are the different approaches or approach we'll take? This is what we'll talk about in this strategy. In methodology, we'll talk about specific approaches. We'll talk about the tools. We'll talk about the data sources. For example, where we will get the data, risk data from to do all this measurement. Are we doing some simulation or not? So these are things that we'll talk about. We'll be more specific in terms of approach, tools, and data sources. Then, roles and responsibility. Roles and responsibility, what we really mean is for different type of risk management activities that we'll be identifying, who will be the team? What will be the team that will handle that? Because once you identify the risk, we have to have someone assigned that who will be handling this risk as we move through the project. So we can put a team for each particular risk management type of risk management activity, along with one lead and so on. It all depends on how big and complex your project is. And of course, when you put those teams and members assigned to different type of risk management activity, we should also clarify responsibilities they'll have. So this is what we'll put in the risk management plan. Then we'll also talk about funding. One of the things is, what are the funds, how much or where we'll get the fund from for this risk management. And then also we'll talk about what is the protocol for application of contingency reserve. If we need to actually use contingency reserve because a risk got triggered, then what is the protocol? And same for management reserve. How will we go about applying the management reserve that we have kept for unknown risks? Then the timing. Timing, when and how often the processes will be performed. For example, how often will we do the risk identification? How often will we be doing the qualitative risk analysis? So this is something that we'll put together in the risk management plan. Risk categories, we will talk about some kind of structure, breakdown structure. They are really hierarchical representation of sources of risk. So we have looked at different breakdown structure. If you remember, we had one work breakdown structure, we had one risk breakdown structure, resource breakdown structure, right? Now we are talking about risk breakdown structure. Now risk breakdown structure is again hierarchical representation like those breakdown structures, but this is about risks. So let's take an example and see how does a risk breakdown structure look like. So we have a project risk, and we can think of different categories, different types of risk. There may be technical risk, there may be management risk, commercial risk, external risk. Now again, when we drill down each of them, when we drill down the technical risk, we see there is a risk in the definition, scope definition, risk in estimates, technology, and we have drilled down to one more level. Similarly, for management, there might be project management risk, resourcing risk, organizational risk. If you look at commercial, there can be risk in the contract. So that is something that we need to look at. Or the supplies and vendors, or even the stability of the, we are talking about customer stability, because if the customer changes or there's something happens on the customer side or project get affected, so there are some commercial risks. And there is some external risk. For example, there might be some regulatory risk, competition risk. Now again, each of them we can go down one more level and one more level till that point where we are comfortable. Now, this risk breakdown structure helps us when we are going to identify risk. It will help us identify the source of risk. And that is, so risk breakdown structure can be very useful in that. It is not necessary that all the organization will adopt risk breakdown structure, but if they don't, there might be some other ways to identify the risks, sources of risk. Then, shareholder risk appetite. They are really some measurable risk threshold around each activity. So basically, each different project, different risk that we're talking about, individual risk, we will talk to the stakeholders, we'll ask them questions and find out what is the risk threshold or risk appetite, and we will put them together in a way that it is measurable. And then the probability and impact definition. So here what we'll do is, in the plan, we'll put a definition how we will decide which is what level and all that. So we'll look at that. It defines the levels of probability and impact. When we say it's a high, what does it mean in terms of probability? What does it mean in terms of impact? So this is a definition, probably will put it, and this definition, how many levels and what each level means, will of course differ from project to project, because it is very specific to the project context. And again, number of levels can vary, right? Because how the project is. For a large project, there might be more levels. For a small project, there might be less. So let's look at an example. So let's say we are looking at impact on three different project objectives, and these are what are our most important project objectives that we look at, and where the scope or the baselines are based on, like schedule baseline, cost baseline, and scope baseline. Now, and also the probability. So when do we say they're high? When do we say we can just ignore them? When do we say they're moderate? So for example, we can say that if the probability is 80%, more than 80%, we are saying there's a very high probability. If the time delay, for example, is greater than 4 months, then we are saying that it is very high. Similarly, cost, similarly, quality. And again, we have this scale on the opportunity side, on the threat side. There is positive risk and the negative risk. Now, having said that, we have to remember this is very project specific. What is something here in our project may be completely different in another project. For example, just if you can see the cost, we are saying if the axis, if that variability is 1 million. Now, some project might be just 1 million, or the total budget might be 1 million. So we'll have to make sure that we understand that this definition of probability and impact is very project specific. So again, you will put together different scales: high, medium, low, very low, and something that we can just ignore. So this is how we put together definition, and that can be probably used later when we identify risk and when we do qualitative analysis and so on. Then there is this probability and impact matrix that, when we put together, can help us in the qualitative risk analysis, on defining the priority and so on. So this impact matrix, basically what we're saying is we put together a table where we can take that combination of probability and impact, and that is basically what we're saying the most important factors in determining how we prioritize risk. And the way we put together this matrix can be in descriptive term or can be in numerical term. What we really do is we create an overall score based on probability and impact when we are using the numerical value. And it is really the calculation of mathematical impact, the mathematical expectation. We apply mathematical expectation to determine the score that reflects the probability and impact. So let's take an example. Let's say we put on the y-axis the different levels of probability or the probability scale. And here in the x, we are putting the impact scale. So impact, again, very low to high, very high. And in the probability, we are saying that it's 0 to 0.9. And so this is a matrix that we are going to create. Now, on one side, it will be threat. On another side, it will be opportunities. So let's take a point where the probability is 0.7 and the impact is what we're saying 0.2. Now, when we have this and that, so in a situation, a risk that has a probability of occurrence is 0.7, 70%, the impact is 0.2, what we do is we get the overall score by multiplying probability times the impact, and that is going to give us 0.14. So we create this table by calculating all the cells on the threat side. Similarly, on the opportunity side. Now, once we have that matrix, probability and impact matrix, we will probably go ahead and say, hey, anything, if the score is 0.05 or less, then we are saying that it is low risk. Now, if it is more than 0.05 and it is equal to or less than 0.4, then we are saying it's moderate risk. And if it is more than 0.4, it is high risk. So this is how I've defined this probability and impact matrix, so that when we go down in the risk analysis and we want to prioritize those risks, we can use this table, and this table can be used across the board for our project. Then there is a reporting format. That is also something we'll put in the risk plan. What kind of reporting format and how the outcome will be documented, analyzed, and communicated. And in particular, the two important reports or documents that will come out. One is the risk register. Now, risk register is a document that will create here and we'll take it through. And this will not only list the risk, but also as we move along, what action we are taking, what we expected, and so on and so forth. So here in the risk management plan, we'll put together a risk register format, how we will use, depending on how we are going to use this risk register. And then we have the risk report, because there'll be different reporting that we'll be doing, and what is the kind of format that we want for the risk in terms of sources, in terms of how we summarize that, and so on. And then finally, we'll also put together how we'll be tracking, how these risk activities will be recorded, tracked, and how this process will be audited. So all these things we'll put together in the risk management plan. So that will be our guide, that will be our roadmap as we move through subsequent processes in risk management. So going on from here, our next set of risk planning steps are, we'll first take up identify risk, where we'll be identifying different risks. Then we'll take those risks and perform qualitative risk analysis. After we do the qualitative risk analysis, we'll perform quantitative risk analysis. And then, based on the analysis that we have done, based on how we have prioritized those risks that we have identified, we will go ahead and plan what kind of responses we will have if this risk gets triggered. So with this, let's move on to our next process, which is identify risk. Now, identify risk, again, if you look at it as a process, will have different inputs. So amongst the inputs, one definitely will be the risk management plan, which is inside the risk, which is inside the project management plan. And there will be some documents, agreements, procurement docs, and then we'll have used different tools. And the most important output that we'll get out here is risk register. Risk register and also the risk report. So identify risk. It does a few things. One is it will identify individual project risks. We talked about that. What is the individual project risk? Basically, individual project risks are risks that will be affecting project objectives, one or more project objectives. And then it will also identify sources of overall project risk. At the overall level, what are the different sources? And they might be a combination of individual project risk as well as something totally outside. So, and that might impact the project, overall project, and which is the, and what are the different sources of overall project risk. Then, at this point, though we are not actually deciding on what kind of response that we'll be doing, that will come later in another process, we will gather information for appropriate responses in this particular process. And then finally, we have to remember that this identifying risk is an iterative process. It is not that we do at the beginning and then these are the risks, yes, we are done, and we keep on tracking that. Because what happens is the risks can surface anytime. So as we move through the projects, we have to continually see if there are new risks that is coming, and we need to carry on with this risk identification process. So it is an iterative, it goes through the project life cycle. Now, we use different tools. One is, for example, in the data gathering, the brainstorming. Now, when we do brainstorming, we have seen we do brainstorming in many other areas. For in this particular case, when we're doing brainstorming for risk identification, our objective is to get a comprehensive list of the risk, potential risk in the project. And when we do that, we will typically have bring in experts from different disciplines and more often than not from outside our projects to actually understand what are possible risks that can impact our project. Now, this discussion can either be free form brainstorming, or it can be just some structure. Maybe we'll have our risk breakdown structure, and we'll have that guide our discussion or our brainstorming. Then the checklist. Checklist is again basically what we do is we take this is a checklist of some items or action or some points. So, and they are based on some what has been knowledge that has been acquired from previous projects. So in fact, what can happen is in your organization, there might be a checklist of different things to be considered, different items or different types of risks that have been encountered in other projects and so on. There might be a checklist, and you might use that to help yourself identify risk in your project. And this checklist often in the organization that is there has to go through continual review because that more things might come in, some things might not be relevant anymore, and so on. And then interview, of course, is a very a common approach or tool that is used, where you actually go and talk to the stakeholders or different project participants, stakeholders, and subject matter experts. So you go and talk to them, ask them question, and gather what they think. And typically, when you do it properly, you will get information out of them, which, it might not be possible to get through other means. Then again, we can do look at identifying risk through data analysis, like root cause analysis. Now, root cause analysis, we saw that it is, for example, we saw it is it was done for some other things like errors or quality and so on. So we were trying to find the underlying cause for something that has happened. But here, it can also be identified for opportunities and threat. So what we'll do is, so this is the kind of typical thing that we saw when we are talking about some risk, for example, and we take the end goal, and again here we'll do end objective, and we'll go down and try to find the underlying cause, and that will help us give the source of risk. Assumptions and constant analysis is again another data analysis that will help us identify risk. Because what happens is, when we have gone through different process and we created different documents like scope, like schedule, like cost estimates, we have done different estimates, and there has always been some assumptions. And so here in the risk identification, we'll look at the assumptions that we had and try to see what is the validity. Are they valid? And through that exercise, we might be able to uncover some risk. And especially if there are some inaccuracies or inconsistencies. For example, in your cost estimate, you have made some estimate, and you have scheduled and you have made estimate, and based on the rate on the resources and all that, it really doesn't tell you. And so there is an inconsistency between the cost estimate and the schedule estimate. And there is some risk that you can directly see. So this is, and at the same time, when we have had constraints and when we make this analysis, if we see the constraint that we thought at that point of time is not actually constraint, and that can be removed, that can give rise to opportunities, because constraints stop us. Constraint hinder or put us in a box. So when we remove that, it can open up opportunities for the project. So assumptions and constant analysis can help us in identify risk. And again, when you're talking about risk, remember all the time we are talking both positive and negative risk. Then another technique in the data analysis is the SWOT analysis. SWOT analysis is a strength, weakness, opportunities, and threat. And that we do for different things in organization, for strategy analysis and so on. But here, let's see how we apply this SWOT analysis to the risk. Now, in an organization, we will have do this strength, weakness, opportunities, and threat. So here in this particular risk, and this is what the strength SWOT analysis is about. So in the risk here, risk analysis or identifying the risk, what we do is, we look at the strength in the organization that can give rise to opportunities. And we'll see, and remember, opportunities are our positive risk. At the same time, weaknesses, we can look at the weaknesses, and that will give rise to our threats or negative risk. And then we can see if there are some opportunities or positive risks that nullify or mitigates some of the threats. So this is with this exercise, we can find some risk. We can identify some risk. Then document analysis is another technique that helps us in identifying risk. Because in many of these documents, as you have prepared, there might have been some uncertainty. There might have been some ambiguity in those documents that can give rise to risk. And there might be some inconsistency within documents. And so what happens is we can look at different documents. For example, the plan, the assumptions and constraints, agreements, technical documentation, all these things, when we analyze, it might surface some risk. For example, in agreements, for the agreements that we have with a vendor, there might be a clause that when we analyze, we'll see that, hey, this can be a problem, or it might be difficult for us to meet that clause, and so then that will give rise to risk. So this is how we can go about identifying risk. So we have looked at data gathering, data analysis. So at the end of this, one very important output will be the risk register that we talked about. Risk register will list all the identified risks, and it will also try to identify the potential risk owners, because risk that we identify, we have to put an owner to that risk. And so that someone is in control, is accountable, is really onto it as we move through the project. And also at this point, potential risk responses, we are not really deciding on that. That will come later, but we still list down potential risk responses. In addition, there might be some other things that we'll put in. What is the status? What is the deadline? Those other things that we might have. Now, one thing to remember that in the risk register, because this is the first step in identifying risk. We are identifying the risk, we're putting them in the risk register. And as we move through, this risk register will keep on getting updated through all these processes that will go through, because probably one of the column for each of the risks will be what is the priority, high priority, low priority. That will get filled up when we go through the qualitative and quantitative risk analysis, and then so on. So this risk register will get updated as we move through and through the life of the project. Then, of course, the risk report is another output, which will where we'll put in sources of overall project risk. We talked about the overall project risk and what are the different sources that can create that. And at the same time, a summary of all the individual project risks, saying that how many individual project risks are there, what categories, and what is the priorities, and so on. So that report will give a big picture about what kind of risks are there in the project. Once we have identified, we will move into our next process, which is the risk analysis, qualitative risk analysis. Now, in qualitative risk analysis, again, we'll have the management plan, project documents. In the project documents, our risk register will be one of the documents. And then we'll use different tools. And then finally, we'll basically update. There will be updates, and the update will be primarily on the risk register. And the qualitative risk analysis, what we really do, we prioritize. We prioritize individual risks. Now, why we are saying for further analysis? Because this is the first step. And typically what will happen is, and again, it depends from project to project, if we see a risk is a high priority, it has probably high probability and high impact, then we might want to take it down further through the quantitative risk analysis. So we'll prioritize that, and then it is a quick way to prioritize here through qualitative risk analysis. And here once we have done that, we can put our focus on high priority risk as we are doing further analysis. This is a fast and subjective approach because it is not so time consuming, not so much effort that otherwise we'll need in the quantitative risk analysis. So it is really quick in that sense. Having said that, because it is subjective, we need to be careful of the bias that might creep in. Bias when stakeholders were getting input from the stakeholders, probably our bias as we are doing the analysis. So we should be careful about the bias that might creep in and how we can mitigate that, how we can stem that. But essentially, it can lay the foundation for further analysis. So what we typically do is, before we step into the numerical analysis or quantitative analysis, risk analysis, we go through the risk analysis process. And this is done on a regular basis through the life cycle as risks are identified. Because as we have said, we will keep on identifying risks as we move through the project, and because new risks will come all the time as we move through the project, as circumstances changes and new inputs come in. And when we have any kind of new risk, the first thing that we'll do is the qualitative risk analysis. Now, in the qualitative risk analysis, when we do, we can do some data analysis that can be useful. One is a data quality assessment. In data quality assessment, we really assess degree or accuracy of the data. And we can do that. For example, we can put a questionnaire to the measuring stakeholders' perception, and we can ask them questions in terms of completeness, objectivity, relevance, and timeliness. These are things that we can check with them and see, how the data quality is. Then this, we can also go through that probability and impact assessment. So let's look at that, because when our objective here, remember, is to prioritize which are high risk, which are low risk, so that we can put our focus on the higher risk rather than the lower risk. And two key factors are probability and impact. And that's what we talked about, probability and impact metrics. So let's look at, we'll look at in a moment how we apply that. So risk probability and impact assessment, basically what we do is likelihood that a specific risk will occur and the impact, and the potential effect on schedule, cost, quality, or performance. So this is what we look at, try to understand when we are doing a probability and impact assessment. And it is evaluated through interview and meeting, because we want to understand the probability, where we are going to get the probability of this particular thing to happen. We'll talk to people and we'll interview who we think will know more, have gone through that, and so on. So let's take an example. Let's say and when we are doing this, essentially our idea is to take understand the combined effect of probability and impact. And so we'll do that through the overall score. So let's say there is a risk that technology might change. And if because of the technology changes, it might impact our project. Now that is a risk, technology change. And what you're saying is, because technology changes all the time, the probability of that happening is pretty high. But the impact, if it happens, we don't think it is really high, it is medium. And so we decide, because probability is high, impact is medium, the overall score is medium. Similarly, we look through all the other risks. For example, loss of critical team members, the probability is low because what we are saying is we take good care of our people, and so people generally will not leave the project. But if someone leaves, a critical term leaves, its impact is very high. And then we decide, because the probability is low, probably the overall score is low. So similarly, we can go through all the different risks. For example, if we talk about a critical vendor, and if they go bankrupt, then what is going to happen? But they're going bankrupt because we know they have been dealing with them for a long time, its probability is low. But if they really go bankrupt, the impact will be high. And the combination will decide its medium. So here you see, we are doing through some descriptive measurement, right? And this is called the ordinal approach. As opposed to that, the same thing we can do a little more numerically. For example, this technology change, we say the probability is 0.7, the impact is 0.2, and the overall score is 0.4. We multiply these two numbers. Similarly, we can go through each of the risks and get the number for the probability, number for the impact, and see what is the overall score. And when we do that, from this overall score, now we know from that probability and impact matrix that we created, we know which is the high one, which is the medium, which is the low. When we take this approach through numbers, it is called the cardinal approach. So now, when the way we are prioritizing this risk, we see that probability and impact plays a very important part. But in addition to that, you can think of some others as well. There are some other factors that can also be looked at when you want to decide if it is a high priority or low priority risk. For example, urgency. So time to effective implementation. If the time to you have to implement it very quickly, then there is urgency, high urgency. Time before risk has an impact. So the risk comes in and immediately it has an impact. We say it's a very low proximity, and that will affect how you prioritize your risk. Dormancy, time before impact of risk is discovered. If it is taking too much, we discover it after quite some time, or we discover it immediately, that is also going to affect how we prioritize the risk. Manageability, how we can manage the risk. Then controllability, so how much control one has on the outcome, final outcome. That can also help us decide how we do priority. To easily detect, detectability. Is it high detectability? Then it will impact our, for example, the priority of the risk. Because if it is something that is very difficult to detect, then we might be suffering that risk we don't even realize, and that will have an impact. And that's why that will again come and impact our how much priority we should give the risk. Connectivity is, if this particular risk is affecting or connected to other project risk, so that we can also help us decide where should that risk be in the prioritization scale. Again, strategic impact, what kind of impact it has an organizational strategy, and what is the stakeholder perception. So all this can also be taken in deciding what is the priority of the risk, and when we are doing the qualitative risk analysis. So with this, we have finished this particular process, and we'll go into the next set of risk management process in our next session on Monday. So thank you for being with me and have a good weekend.